Today's episode is sponsored by I Know What You Did Last Summer. Get it now on digital. When 5 friends inadvertently cause a deadly car accident, they cover up their involvement and make a pact to keep it a secret rather than face the consequences. A year later, their past comes back to haunt them, and they're forced to confront a horrifying truth. Someone knows what they did last summer and is hell-bent on revenge. As one by one, the friends are stalked by a killer, they discover this happened before, so they turn to 2 survivors of the legendary Southport Massacre of 1997 for help. Starring Madeline Klein, Chase Sue Wonders, Jonah Hauer King with Freddie Prinze Jr. and Jennifer Love Hewitt. I Know What You Did Last Summer is a perfect summer slasher, says Jordan Cruciolo of NPR. Your summer is not over yet. Don't miss a killer movie night at home.
Warning, the following podcast is not suitable for all audiences. We go into great detail with every case that we cover and do our best to bring viewers even deeper into the stories by utilizing disturbing audio and sound effects.
Trigger warnings from the stories we cover may include violence, rape, murder, and offenses against children.
This podcast is not for everyone. You have been warned.
The sun had just begun to set on February 18th, 1988. And the police in Rochester, Minnesota could not believe what they were seeing. A cold wind lashed against the Brom family home as the officers carefully crept from room to room. This was the home of a well-respected family, pillars of their Catholic church, and in many ways, an embodiment of the American dream. How their home turned into the crime scene that the police were standing in, they would never understand. At the base of the stairs was a bloodied axe. But what awaited the police upstairs was something you only see in nightmares. First, they found the bodies of 40-year-old Paulette Brom and her 13-year-old daughter Diane. Both had been struck repeatedly with an axe and left holding on to each other, even in death. Next, they found the bodies of 41-year-old Bernard still in bed, and 11-year-old Ricky, who was clinging on to his comfort blanket as he took his last breath. While looking at the carnage, it seemed like a crime that only a monster would be capable of, but the reality was much more terrifying. This crime hadn't been committed by a seasoned criminal, nor a vicious stranger. It had been committed by someone the family knew and loved. So this is the story of the Brom family massacre. I'm Courtney Browen.
And I'm Colin Browen.
And you're listening to Murder in America.
Rochester, Minnesota, located in Olmsted County, is the 3rd most populous city in the state, with a population of over 120,000 residents. It's considered safe, with a lower than average crime rate. Their public schools are highly rated, and they have a great economy with lots of jobs and room for growth. Rochester is also the birthplace of one of the top-rated hospitals in the world, the Mayo Clinic. So it's a desirable city to not only live and work in, but also to raise a family in. And it wasn't much different in the 1980s.
When Bernard and Paulette Brom were planning out their futures, they decided that this would be the perfect place to settle down. They were drawn to the stability of the city and the quality of the schools. So in the 1980s, they moved into a comfortable middle-class 2-story home in a quiet, well-to-do area in Cascade Township, just north of Rochester. The location was perfect for them. Most of the homes were filled with good families. And even though this area was rural, it was close enough to everything they needed, including schools, jobs, and shopping centers. Upon moving to the community, many people in the area thought that the Broms had it all: a loving marriage, 4 beautiful children, lucrative careers, and a stable home. But as we know, looks can be deceiving, and behind closed doors, the family struggled with some underlying tension. Tension that, for the most part, went unnoticed by friends and neighbors.
The patriarch, Bernard Francis Brom, who went by the nickname Barn, was born on August 13, 1946 in Anoka, Minnesota. And from an early age, he was a very disciplined child. His mother, Catherine, admitted that he would often wake up at 4 a.m. to study before going to school. During high school, Bernard was active in the Monogram Club, track, wrestling, and cross country. He had a very specific goal: to break the 2-minute, 2-second half-mile record. Now, although not much is known about his childhood and upbringing, it's clear that he aimed to overachieve in both academics and sports. After high school, he was attending St. John's University when he crossed paths with a woman named Paulette Joan Haugen. At the time, she was attending his university's sister school, St. Benedict. Upon meeting, the two immediately hit it off. And something that was very important to them was that they shared similar values. They were both very devoted to their Catholic faith. So, it seemed like a match made in heaven when the two could connect over their beliefs, which really were the core of who they felt they were. Eventually, the couple even transferred schools together, deciding to attend the University of Minnesota to further their education. In May of 1968, Bernard graduated with a bachelor's in mechanical engineering. And with that degree, he would go on to get a well-paying job at IBM as an advisory engineer. A few months after graduation, in July of 1968, Barn and Paulette got married at Resurrection Catholic Church. It was the start of their life together. And from the beginning, they decided that their faith was going to be the foundation of their family. Bernard even served as a Eucharist minister at their church, and Paulette worked as the director of the church's preschool. In addition, they also counseled other married couples at the church's faith-based relationship program called Renew. The priest at Pax Christi told local media outlets that the Broms were quiet leaders of the church and very well respected by everyone. Paulette, especially, was loved and respected by the children at the church. All her life, she had aspired to be a teacher, and in 1969, she was awarded that role for a lifetime with the birth of her first child, Joseph Leonard Brom. 3 years later, on October 3, 1971, came their son, David Francis. Then in 1974, Diane Marie, and finally, in 1976, came Richard Michael. Barn and Paulette had their hands full with 4 young children, but they wouldn't have had it any other way. In spite of her busy schedule, Paulette was remembered as a compulsive giver of time, love, talent, food, money, and herself. Apart from being a mother and active member of their church, Paulette was also a talented seamstress, even taking on commissions from time to time.
By all accounts, the Brom children were good kids. They of course grew up in a Catholic home, but they rarely ever argued with their parents about the strict rules. During one summer, they even traveled to Haiti for missions work. According to the people around them, the family was very normal. Their daughter Diane was described as having, quote, beautiful red hair, freckles, and a shy smile, end quote. She was active in her school's basketball and cheerleading programs. She also loved sewing, just like her mom, and she was talented at playing the piano. Then there was the youngest son, Ricky. He also enjoyed sports, especially football. One of his favorite things to do was watch football games on TV with his grandfather. He also loved riding his bike and playing computer games. Barn and Paulette's oldest 2 boys, Joe and David, got along well. In fact, it was said that David wanted to be just like his older brother. David was described as polite and friendly. He had a lot of friends and he loved to make everyone laugh with his witty jokes. He was also studious. He never skipped school and always maintained a B+ average. As for the people in their neighborhood, everyone liked David, even describing him as, quote, dependable and cheerful. If someone needed a babysitter, he would always step up to help. During the winters, when the snow piled up on everyone's driveways, he would shovel it, always refusing to accept payment for his work. So as you can see, they were good kids. Barnett and Paulette were respected. The Broms appeared and aspired to be the all-American family, with their white picket fence and all. And throughout the 70s and early 80s, it seemed like they had achieved just that.
By 1985, however, chips had begun to crack in the family's carefully crafted facade. Joe, the oldest of the 4 siblings, had begun doing what teenagers do best, rebelling. He was 16, and with that age comes experimentation and growth. But Joe wasn't doing the things you're probably thinking. He didn't drink, do drugs, fight, or sleep around. He simply found himself in a subculture that many viewed as the antithesis of his parents' aspirations for him. This was 1985, a summer that was referred to by some as the Revolution Summer, due to a strong resurgence of hardcore punk that rippled across the country. Punk pushed for activism, individuality, and emotional expression, and Joe loved everything about the punk movement: the music, the clothes, and even the makeup. Soon enough, he began dressing in punk attire, listening to punk music, and wearing dark eyeliner, all of which his parents furiously disapproved of. Over time, Joe and his parents fought frequently about this change they saw in their son, which resulted in an incident that's almost hard to believe. According to 2 family friends, Anita Fetch and Mary Richardson, sometime in 1985, Barn and Paulette took Joe to St. Mary's, a psychiatric institution, under the guise that he was getting a checkup. Instead, they had him institutionalized. His psychiatrist there reported, "Joe is just a typical adolescent rebelling against family rules, and there's nothing wrong with him psychologically or chemically. He just dresses punk." That's an exact quote. Upon Joe's release, he moved in with his best friend, Edward Richardson, whose parents welcomed him with open arms, in spite of what Paulette allegedly told Mary Richardson, Edward's mother. Mary stated that Mrs. Brom told her, quote, "Joe is extremely argumentative, stubborn, and more than you can handle. Once you see him, you won't want him," end quote. But Mary did want him, so much so that in time, she became his foster mother, and until his dying breath, she remained family. Mary later told the courts that between Thanksgiving and December 17th of 1985, the Broms only came to the house to see Joe twice, once when they dropped him off and once when they picked him up. The Richardsons were scheduled to go on vacation for Christmas in 1985, and they weren't planning on taking Joe with them. The day before their flight, they called the Broms saying that Joe needed to be picked up. Mary testified, quote, "I was just livid because the Broms never made any arrangements to get Joe or for him to live elsewhere. He was only 16 and it was 20 below zero and he had nowhere to go," end quote. In the call, demanding that the Broms come pick up their son, Mary snapped, saying, quote, "I can't believe my family loves Joe more than his own parents do," end quote. When the Broms eventually did pick Joe up, they didn't say a word to the Richardsons. As soon as the Richardsons returned home from vacation, Joe moved back in with them and never lived in his biological family's home again.
So clearly, there was a lot of tension within the Brom household around this time. And it was especially hard on David, who always looked up to his older brother. But in spite of the challenges he was facing, he was still described as a good kid. One of his school counselors would later say, quote, "David's attendance was excellent. His grades were good. His relationship with teachers seemed very good. So there was nothing that would show there might be problems in the Brom household," end quote. His Spanish teacher also thought very highly of him, saying, quote, "David was an above average student. He got B's in my class. He was pleasant, quiet, but we got along well," end quote. However, beneath the surface, David was suffering from severe depression, an issue that escalated over time. Now, as we know, in the 1980s, mental health wasn't talked about like it is today, especially among teenagers. And due to social stigma, people who suffered with depression and anxiety usually suffered in silence. Sadly, this was the case with David. Although he acknowledged his own depression, he thought that if he just portrayed himself as happy and made others around him happy, that his depression would eventually go away. And he had everyone fooled: his friends, teachers, and his family. But by June of 1987, he could no longer keep up with his happy facade.
It was the summer after his freshman year of high school, and the weight pressing on David had become too much. In the midst of the few months of sunshine and warmth that graced the Minnesota woods, David went for a walk. It wasn't to take in the scenery with a smile, nor to relish the feeling of the fresh, pine-soaked air. At this point in his life, David was incapable of either of those. Instead, he was drowning in a sea of gray numbness, and he was tired of it. Along the walk, he stopped at the base of a sturdy tree. Then he threw a noose under one of the branches, and in that moment, he prepared himself to die, to let go of the pain he had been feeling. But just before following through with it, he panicked. He stepped away from the tree and walked back home in a thick fog. He never told his parents what he had gone into the forest to do. By September, however, he decided to try again. According to sources, this time around, David had acquired prescription sleeping pills from a girl at school who used them for a sleeping disorder, and while alone in his room, he tried to overdose on a handful of the medication. But the dosage wasn't right. Instead of slipping into a coma, David became violently ill, throwing up and unable to move. His parents asked what was wrong, and in response, David brushed off the truth. He told his parents that he must have caught a stomach bug, and his parents believed him. Really, they had no reason not to. In a later interview with psychiatrist Dr. Carl Malmquist, David admitted that he was disappointed that he had been unsuccessful in his second suicide attempt.
Things at home had become increasingly frustrating for David, especially after his older brother was kicked out of the house. It seemed as if Barn and Paulette didn't want their other children to follow in Joe's footsteps, so they became even more strict with David, Diane, and Ricky. Now at this time, satanic panic was at its height. The media was constantly demonizing kids for wearing black and listening to alternative music, sensationalizing the idea that they were murderers, drug addicts, and Satan worshippers. For parents like Paulette and Barn, who lived and breathed their faith, this was about the worst thing they could imagine their children becoming. We aren't saying it's right, but we do feel like their beliefs and the media sensationalism at the time had a big impact on why they felt so extreme about Joe becoming punk. So they held tightly onto the children that were still under their roof. At home, to keep the kids in line, they gave the children an ever-increasing list of chores, including chopping firewood to keep the family warm in the winters. According to David, if any of the children failed to do the chores or rebelled in any way, both of their parents would physically punish them. In a later interview, a psychiatrist who spoke with David wrote the following.
Events which happened to him, while unpleasant, had become greatly magnified in his own thinking. They had become overwhelming and seen as impossible to deal with. Hence, he described episodes where his father would slap him, usually once at a time, although on rare occasions 2-3 times in succession, and with an open hand. David never described his father hitting him with a fist, nor ever receiving any beatings. Yet to David, the nature of the anticipation of being slapped in such a manner by his father was experienced as something he came to dread. It was experienced as one of the things he could not deal with, and from which he needed, desperately, to escape. On these occasions, he would feel terrified. The striking thing is David's overreaction and sensitivity, his inability to deal with his father, and the persistent fear which did not leave.
Now, contrary to David's statements of being abused, his grandfather would later state, quote, "There was no excessive strictness that we could ever see. I don't think they were abusive parents or overly strict," end quote. But whatever was going on within the Brom home, David felt like an outsider. He did not have a great relationship with his father, and he admitted that the two hardly ever spoke. Deep down, David craved his father's approval, but he believed it was impossible to achieve that. However, it was reported that Barn had taken steps to actively involve David in his life. The father and son started running together, a passion that David held on to for years to come. He and his dad also started working on restoring an old car, but unfortunately, his father's efforts to fix their relationship didn't help, and it didn't fix what had been brewing inside David for quite some time. Under the surface, he was still suffering from depression, and instead of discussing it with his parents, he internalized it and he carried on with his life as if nothing was wrong. After his brother Joe was kicked out, David felt more and more isolated. But even afterwards, the two brothers still kept in contact. In fact, they actually worked together at a restaurant in town. But even so, with Joe gone, the dynamic within the Brom household changed. Perhaps David believed that Joe was his only ally, the only one who understood the pressure of growing up in a tightly controlled, religious household. And now that Joe was gone, he was left to navigate that alone. But even the people closest to the family had no idea there were big issues going on. A girl named Patty Price, who was extremely close with the Broms, would later say of David, quote, "I viewed him the same as I did my own brothers. He was not a monster. He was a super nice kid. I spent many nights at their house, and the parents were nothing but kind." End quote. Now, despite David's attempts to maintain a happy and friendly facade, his mental health continued to decline, and after a while, he began to harbor truly dark fantasies. Eventually, he even started telling people about them. In one fantasy that he shared with his friends at school, David stated that he wanted to murder his parents, steal all of their money, and take the family van to Florida with his friends, most of whom were girls. In these fantasies, when they all got to Florida, David said he wanted to live it up all the way until the money ran out. Then he would end his life, and he wanted the girls he was with to do the same. According to one of his friends, David and another girl named Angie would often talk about this vacation fantasy. One of his friends later said, quote, "We had a sort of vacation planned, which seemed more like a story that we would add things into to make it more exciting, add into the plot. Like an ongoing story, but not written, just a conversation piece that we would have. It involved me, Angie, and Dave going to Florida this summer, and how we would live off the money we would have and just get an apartment and have fun. We had to get a car to get down there, and he said that the way we could do that was for him to get rid of his parents so that we could have a car. He would kill his family and call into IBM and tell them that there had been a death in the family, so Mr. Brom would be taking off a few weeks, so therefore no one would be looking for him. I just thought it was a way to make the plot more exciting in our conversations, like saying when I grow up I want to do this, just making a storyline and making everything more dramatic. But it wasn't like a big plan. It wasn't planned to happen on February 18th. The whole thing was pretty much to live it up before, and Dave said he wanted to die, and me and Angie didn't want to die. Just when we talked to each other, we always said when he does that, we'll just leave because we didn't want that. But it was still just a part of the story for me and Angie." End quote.
Despite David's elaborate details of his fantasies, none of his friends believed he was serious. The way he joked about it so nonchalantly made them believe it was just all talk. The idea that someone like David, quiet, polite, intelligent, and harmless, could carry out such a violent act against his own parents was absurd. Unfortunately, he was determined to make his fantasies a reality, and on Thursday, February 18th, 1988, the entire community of Rochester would be forced to witness them. The night before, on February 17th, David was laying in his room, listening to some new punk music. Inspired by his older brother, David had started dabbling in the new genre. But as he sat there, enjoying the music, he was startled by his father suddenly bursting into the room. Immediately, he reprimanded his son, appalled by the album. From there, the two got into a heated argument, where Barn threatened to take away his son's music collection. According to court testimony, Barn then pushed David into a table, and fearing that he would be struck, David fled. Now, after a few hours, the tension within the home began to subside. For Barn, Paulette, Diane, and Ricky, it was simply an argument between a father and son that got heated, and eventually they all went to sleep. But unbeknownst to them, David was still angry. Soon enough, he returned to his bedroom to continue listening to his music. And then, at around 1:30 a.m., his phone rang. It was one of David's friends from school, one of the many friends that he shared his Florida fantasy with. Supposedly, during this call, David asked the girl if she would skip school with him the next day if they didn't have to worry about his parents. Now, it's unclear how long the phone call lasted, how much information David disclosed, or what the girl replied with, but David seemed to be planning on making his fantasies a reality.
For the next few hours, David listened to music and wallowed in his own emotions. To this day, he's never completely disclosed what was going through his mind, but we do know that they weren't good thoughts. It's believed that his depression had become too much to bear, and he believed that there was only one way to rid himself of these feelings: by eliminating the source. Around 3 a.m., David left his bedroom and tiptoed through the house into the garage, careful not to make any noise that would wake his family members. Once in the garage, David grabbed a 28-inch long-handled axe. Then, he snuck into the kitchen and also grabbed a steak knife. With a weapon in each hand, he slowly walked into his parents' bedroom on the second floor and entered the room. All was quiet as Bernard and Paulette peacefully slept. David first approached his father's side of the bed. After all, he seemed to be the source of his anger. In the dark of night, David lifted the axe above his father's head and slammed it down, but it was not a fatal blow. However, it did jolt Bernard out of his slumber, and it was here when he came to a horrifying reality that his son was trying to kill him. Immediately, David continued slamming the axe down on his father. With each blow, Bernard tried to get up, but significant damage had already been done. The commotion woke up Paulette, who was at her husband's side, and all she could do was scream in horror as she watched her son axe his father to death. David would later say this:
When I think about it, I get kind of sick. What I remember is gross. I walk into my parents' room and they're asleep. I have the axe. There's a lot of screaming in there. I'm screaming and they are. I was scared. I don't remember hitting anyone. I could hear the screaming though, and it went on and on.
But David wasn't done. After axing his father to death, he turned his attention to his mother, Paulette. Hoping to escape, Paulette managed to run into the hallway. However, David followed close behind, unrelenting. Once he reached her, he struck his mother with the axe 18 times, 5 times to her face and head, 1 on the back of her hand, and 12 strikes on her upper left shoulder and arm. Much like Bernard, Paulette died right then and there at the hands of her son. And sadly, David wouldn't end there. With his parents dead, David walked down the hallway to his 11-year-old brother's bedroom. It's very likely that Ricky had been awakened by the screams of his parents just down the hall, but not knowing what to do, he stayed in his bed, frozen with fear. Soon after, he saw the silhouette of his brother enter the room, and just like his parents, Ricky began to scream. David axed his little brother 9 times, including once across the neck after he was already dead. But there was still one family member in the home, David's little sister, 13-year-old Diane. After hearing the commotion within the home, Diane ran out of her bedroom and saw her mother's bloodied body in the hallway. By that point, David was already in Ricky's room, killing him. But moments later, Diane watched as he emerged, holding the axe. At that moment, David ran after his sister, hitting her 8 times in total, with fatal wounds to her neck and face. In her last moments, Diane held on to her mother's body in the hallway, and in her arms, she too passed away. Within minutes, 16-year-old David Brom had just annihilated his entire family, excluding his older brother Joe.
The crime scene was horrific, but David walked through it as if nothing happened. He threw the murder weapon down at the bottom of the basement stairs. The axe was so saturated with his family's blood, dropping it left blood spatter on a nearby National Geographic magazine. Then, he made his way back to his bedroom, where he began to pack his belongings. He stuffed a duffel bag full of clothing, blankets, and supplies, as the constant sound of dripping blood droned on in the background. David would later say, "I remember being in my room and packing things like blankets. All the lights were on and I had to go into each room. My brother was in his bedroom and my mother and sister in the hall, and there was blood everywhere." Finally, at around 3:30 a.m., David attempted to call one of his friends, but when the friend's father picked up, David immediately hung up. From there, he took the car keys to the family van, backed it out of the garage, and headed to a local bank where he withdrew a couple $100 from his mother's account. Next, he went to a local supermarket where he purchased a pack of cigarettes and a few snacks. Then he headed to his friend Annick's house. David wanted to speak with her, but it was still early in the morning, so he waited outside of her house watching the sunrise. Eventually, Annick walked outside, ready to head to school, and that's when David approached her. According to Annick, he was frantic, begging her to skip school with him, but Annick said that this wasn't an unusual request. However, what he said next completely shocked her. Here's how Annick said the conversation played out. She asked him,
"So, we're skipping school?"
"Yeah, you need a break."
"Okay, sure, whatever. Do you have the car today?"
"Yeah."
"Why? Did you have work?"
"No, I can get anything I want now. My parents are dead."
Now, Annick would later say that David would often make comments about those fantasies he had, so she assumed this was just another one of those moments. She thought that maybe he was saying that to, quote, make cutting school more exciting. So she asked him, "So you did it?"
"Yep."
From there, Annick hopped into his car, and David drove them to Kutsky Park, where they hung out for a while. Then, the two drove to the IBM credit union, where David withdrew $250 more from his parents' bank account. With that money, they drove to Kmart and bought a pair of hair clippers and some gum. While the two drove around running errands, David told her the details of what had occurred only hours earlier. Annick said, quote, "He said he hit his dad with an axe. He kept hitting his dad, and his dad kept on getting up. He said he just kept swinging," end quote. As for why he committed the murders, David told her that he had gotten into an argument with his father and that he stayed up contemplating his next move until around 3 a.m. David said that he continued to swing the axe for about a half hour. Annick added, quote, "He said it was really gross and that someone has to be sick to do something like this," end quote.
And sick is an understatement. After disclosing all this information, David drove Annick back to her house, and he even went inside, where she used the hair clippers to cut a punk rock hairstyle on David, with the sides shaved and a few lines cut into the back. David was happy with the new look. He also thought it would help him evade detection once his crimes were discovered. But soon enough, David and Annick heard a door open in Annick's house. David quickly ran into the closet, hiding behind her clothes in the dark. No one was supposed to be home, and Annick was supposed to be at school, so both of the teens' hearts were racing. Annick's mother, who had unexpectedly stopped at home, entered the bedroom and demanded that Annick return to school. Annick did as she was told, rushing out of the house. But her mom had no idea that a quadruple murderer was hiding in her daughter's closet. David ended up staying in his hiding place until everyone's footsteps disappeared. Then, once the coast was clear, he got back into the family van. But he wasn't ready to skip town just yet. In fact, he actually picked up some of his friends from high school and ate lunch with them at Godfather's Pizza, just hours after he murdered his family. When he was finished eating, he returned to his family home. While there, he dyed his hair black in the first-floor bathroom. The horrors of his crimes were just upstairs, mere feet away.
From there, David walked out of his family home for the very last time, leaving his family's dead bodies behind. Around 5:30 p.m., he went to Annick's place of employment. David told her he planned to spend the night under a bridge. Then he would travel to Minneapolis the next day. Before he left, he told Annick not to tell a soul about what happened. She later admitted that she was scared. Apparently at this point, David was paranoid and believed the authorities were onto him. And he actually had reason to be. Only minutes earlier, at 5:23 p.m., someone from his high school placed a call to the Olmsted County Sheriff's Department. There was a rumor circulating around school that David Brom had murdered his father. So deputies Michael Braley and Kevin Torgerson were dispatched to the home for a welfare check. At around 6 p.m., Deputy Torgerson was the first to arrive. At the time, the 29-year-old cop had only been with the force for 2 years, but not even a seasoned officer would be prepared for what he was about to discover. As he parked his cruiser on the street outside of the Brom's family home, the night was calm and eerie. The little sounds the quaint street had were muffled by the falling snow. Deputy Torgerson stated, quote, "I knew which house it was, but that I was just going to wait for my backup. We were losing daylight at the time. I think about that time, 6 o'clock. It's getting pretty dark, so I got out and I waited," end quote. Minutes later, Deputy Braley arrived, and from there the two men walked up the driveway. The yellow light from the garage door illuminated some fresh footprints and some tire tracks in the white snow. The officers then announced their presence while opening the front door, but all they heard in response was silence. Slowly, the two scanned the first floor of the house. Nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle. They described the home as, quote, "comfortably disheveled," the remnants of the Brom's normal yet busy lives. But when the officers entered the downstairs bathroom, they got their first sign that things were not completely normal. The sink and floor were smeared with black stains from where David had just dyed his hair. Suspicious, they called out. But once more, they heard nothing but the echo of their own voices. Fearing the worst, both officers drew their weapons and slowly made their way up the stairs. Deputy Torgerson later said, quote, "I turned to start to go up the steps to the second floor. I got up maybe 3, 4, 5 steps. I forgot how high up I got, but just high enough to where I saw the upper landing area, and that's where I saw 2 sets of bare feet. They were obviously pale and not moving, so I turned and whispered back to Mike that it looks like they had 2 people down on the top floor. The stairway was real narrow, so it wasn't like a situation where Mike could get past me to see what I was seeing. We didn't know at that point if we were interrupting something or if there was still someone in the home," end quote. Whatever it was, they knew that something was wrong here. Deputy Torgerson quietly ascended the staircase. He later added, quote, "I got up to nearly the top step, enough to where I could get a sneak peek to the right and left. Of course, I saw the feet would turn out to be 2 females, and their bodies were laying towards the left, so I went that way first. I could see they were obviously deceased. The blood was dried and everything. The injuries were just horrendous. Most of the injuries were about their arms, face, and neck areas, and heads," end quote. The officers had just found the bloodied bodies of Paulette and Diane Brom. Paulette, still wearing her white flannel nightgown, was in a fetal position, her head nestled in the arm of her daughter. Torgerson continued to walk down the hallway and entered the primary bedroom. There, he found the body of Bernard Brom. Torgerson said, quote, "He was really in a kind of weird position, kind of squatting on his knees next to the bed, with his right arm up on the bed, and his head kind of slumped over in front of him. Obviously, he was deceased as well," end quote. Then the officers went further down the hall, and that's when they discovered the 4th and final victim, 11-year-old Ricky Brom, still in bed. Horrifically, he was found clinging on to his blanket. Torgerson stated, quote, "He had again some serious wounds to his head. He was lying in bed in a fetal position, and again, massive injury to his head, multiple other injuries across his body, and he was laying there, clutching a little blanket. Right around that time, it was time to get out of there. I was on overload at that point. I said to Mike, let's get out of here and get some help. We were both pretty much in some form of shock at that point," end quote.
This was one of the worst crime scenes the state of Minnesota had ever seen. It was a complete bloodbath. In total, the Brom family had endured 56 axe wounds, and it was clear that the final moments of their life were nothing short of horrific. Investigators also noted that all 4 bodies were in a state of rigor mortis, meaning that they had been dead for longer than 12 hours. But notably, missing from the scene were the Broms' two oldest sons, Joe and David. So immediately, they set out to find them. It didn't take long for investigators to track down Joe. He was at a restaurant called Henry Wellington where he worked as a cook. And it was there, while on the job, where they informed him of this horrific news, that his family had been murdered. Ultimately, Joe had an alibi on the morning of the murders, so he was cleared. But as for David, he was still unaccounted for. The police immediately issued a nationwide alert to locate the teen with dyed black hair wearing neon pink tennis shoes. Around this time, news of the horrific murders was spreading, but no one who knew David suspected that he was involved. In fact, many believed that he could have also been a victim. Patty Price, Diane's best friend, did an interview with K-Rock News, where she talked about how she found out about the murders and how she feared for David's safety.
A phone call came in, and it was after 8. And back then in 88, that was not normal to have the phone ring after 8 o'clock at night. And my mom got on the phone, and my mom never cried, and she just started wailing. It was really unusual. And I remember just my body stiffening because that was so unusual. And she hung up the phone and came in, and she just couldn't get words out at first. And she said, Patty, you're going to die. I don't know how to tell you this. But Diane's dead. And my body went from being stiff to being stiffer. And my dad's body completely stiffened around me as well. And from that moment forward, it was like a dark cloud had surrounded me and I couldn't move. All I remember about the rest of that night is we found out the whole family was found murdered. David was missing. David was like an older brother to me. And, he had just been cross-country skiing with Diane and I in their backyard the Sunday before. And super nice kid. And we still didn't know at that time what happened to David. I was convinced that he was either kidnapped or he had come in during the murders and fled and was on the run. There was no thought in my mind that he had done anything wrong. I felt really nervous for him.
And many others felt the same. David had been described by almost everyone as a good, respectful kid. He was a great student, a helpful member of his community. Most people who knew him thought that he had to have been a victim as well. It never even crossed their minds that he could have been responsible. But later that evening, one of David's former teachers actually saw him shopping at the Northgate Shopping Center, and immediately she called the police. Around 11 p.m., the Brom family van was found near Methodist Hospital, but David was not inside, and no one had any idea where he was located. Meanwhile, concerned residents, friends, family, and neighbors feared the worst. Many believed David was either dead or had been kidnapped, but in reality, he was sleeping inside of a culvert in an industrial part of town, hiding from the consequences of what he had done.
Around 8:30 a.m., a concerned citizen spotted David using a payphone outside of the Valley High post office. They immediately called the police, and within minutes, the post office was surrounded. One of the arresting officers, Tim Huroff, said, quote, "We saw him right away, standing with his back to the door, staring at some vending machines," end quote. When the officers approached him, he did not resist. From there, David was placed under arrest. During the ride to the Olmsted County Courthouse, he remained silent in the back seat. His arraignment lasted about 15 minutes, and throughout it, he stayed calm, despite the charges he was facing. 4 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. He was also ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation, and he was placed on a 24-hour watch in the county jail.
The Conspiracy Files is the most explosive show on the internet. I'm your host, Colin Brown from The Paranormal Files on YouTube, and I'm inviting you to take this twisted journey down the rabbit hole with me. Together, we will dive deep into some of the world's most dangerous and disturbing conspiracy theories, from suspicious suicides to hidden pedophile rings and high-profile cover-ups. On my show, no story is off limits, and no detail will be spared. And trust me, after listening to just one episode, you will never look at the world the same. So, if you like conspiracies, mysteries, true crime, and chaos, then this is the show for you. Listen to The Conspiracy Files now on all streaming platforms or wherever you get your podcasts.
Good evening. Topping tonight's News 11, police charge a 16-year-old boy with 4 counts of first-degree murder after his family is found axed to death in their Rochester home.
Tonight, there are more questions than answers as police search for a motive.
Police arrested David Brom this morning after they caught up with him at a town post office. He offered no resistance. In court today, Brom listened passively to the charges against him. Now the question is whether to try him as an adult or juvenile. The ordeal happened yesterday in a suburb on the outskirts of Rochester, and the whole town is in shock. We have a team report tonight, beginning with Alan Costantini. It was Thursday night when Olmsted County Sheriff's deputies found the bodies of 4 members of the Brom family in their Cascade, Minnesota home. Bernard and Paulette Brom and 2 of their children, 14-year-old Diane and 9-year-old Rick, had been murdered with an axe. Today, Olmsted County authorities charged 16-year-old David Brom with 4 counts of first-degree murder. First degree because they have witnesses who say the high school sophomore planned the killings of his family.
I think there were 2 subjects mentioned in the complaint indicating that he talked about killing his parents or that he had killed them, and his brother and sister.
Still, authorities say they have no motive and mental tests have been ordered.
We're asking that there be a psychiatric evaluation, yes. And we're meeting with the judge on Monday afternoon to discuss who might do that and obtain that order. The defense is joining in that request.
The question Olmsted County authorities must decide now is whether to charge David Brom as a juvenile or as an adult. As a juvenile, if convicted, he would face less than 3 years in confinement. As an adult, he could get life. All of Rochester is in shock over the killings. John Stone has that story.
These are David Brom's Lourdes High School classmates praying at a special mass at St. John's Church, sharing one student's bewilderment that her classmate is suspected of murder.
I feel sorry for everyone, and I basically think that everyone just hurts.
Well, this is obviously the shock phase. It's beginning to set in. There is, in several cases, extreme grief.
The shock has spread well beyond Lourdes High School, beyond St. Pius Elementary, where David's brother and sister went to school before they were killed. All of Rochester is in disbelief.
It's just, a shock to the whole community. Everyone's talking about it, wondering why.
David is described as well-behaved and polite. The boy who'd shovel his neighbor's snow for free, who'd sit in the front row of Father Jack Kroge's religion class.
David appeared to be happy, interested.
Lourdes High and St. Pius School remained open today, but much of the community went to church, where clergy helped them deal with the murders. But Lourdes Principal Leahy says at his school, that process could take months.
Some of David's classmates at Lourdes High School were still in disbelief. On Saturday, February 20th, a few spoke to the Post-Bulletin and admitted that they didn't believe he was guilty. One said, "It wasn't Dave who did this. He wasn't the type." It was hard to accept that the teenager, weighing only 130 pounds, could have done as much damage as he did. Of course, no one wanted to believe that there was an axe murderer hiding among them, one who had killed his entire family. While the community was still trying to grapple with this horrific tragedy, they really came together to honor the lives lost. On Sunday, February 21st, 1988, the funerals for Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Ricky were held at Pax Christi Catholic Church. There were over 1,200 people in attendance, including several teenagers dressed in punk-style fashions who sat in a special section set aside for youth. St. Pius, the school Diane and Ricky attended, even used their buses to bring students to the funeral. Then, following the service, the family was laid to rest at the Calvary Cemetery. It was a somber day for the community, especially for the people close with the Brom family. Here's Patty Price talking about that day in her interview with KROC News.
I remember we had to sit with our class, and there were 4 caskets brought in, of course all closed. All that I could think of what was on the inside of those caskets. What did the bodies look like? And it was just trauma after trauma. and no help to be found.
But Patty Price would later say that she felt her community was ashamed of what happened.
The 6 months after the murders happened, we went on to Lourdes with the two other grade schools at the time, and boy, we were from the school that had the Brom murder kids,
right?
And that was taboo. We didn't want to talk about it, and other kids didn't want to hear it. They were freaked out to even hear about it, let alone have it happen directly to them. So a lot of us were completely shut down, and a lot of our parents and teachers just, the attitude at that time was, if we don't talk about it, it didn't happen. Just it happened, just let's go on, which, you can't do in a big situation like that.
On Monday, March 7th, 1988, the investigation was officially completed, and the Brom family murders had made national headlines. The idea of a family being axed to death within their home is already horrific enough, but when the perpetrator is a member of the family and a teenager nonetheless, it's all the more shocking. And soon enough, rumors spread about the influence of Satanism and the occult. The overwhelming thought was that no regular teenage boy from a good family would do this, especially since he grew up in a good Catholic home. Surely, they thought at the time, this had to be the work of Satan, and David's punk-style appearance seemed to really add to that false narrative. Another bizarre theory that circulated was that David killed his family after listening to a band called Negativland. Shortly after the Brom murders, the band issued a fake press release claiming that David had been inspired after listening to their song Christianity is Stupid, and investigators even looked into this theory.
Good evening. Topping Nightcast, a possible link between murder and music.
Music performed by a rock group right here in the Bay Area.
4 members of a Midwestern family were murdered. The 16-year-old son is the prime suspect. Members of the experimental rock group Negativland have been drawn into the case, and prosecutors won't even tell them for certain that how their music might be involved. Hal Eisner has our report.
It was the kind of murder case that friends and neighbors said didn't make sense. They didn't understand how an A student from a good family could murder his brother, sister, and parents with an axe.
He was not a homicidal maniac. He did not show any signs of wanting to hurt anyone.
David Brom was accused in the multiple axe slayings, but now, almost 3 months later, many are still wondering why. One explanation may involve a Bay Area music group called Negativland. Negativland's music is highly critical of the mass media, nuclear war, and handguns. The group thinks their music is humorous, but they don't find it a bit funny that one of their songs poking fun at religion may have sparked a dispute among the Broms, triggering the murders. They say federal authorities asked them to cancel a long-planned 17-city tour and eliminate live performances until the conclusion of the investigation. The probe apparently involved their song, Christianity is Stupid.
Christianity is stupid. Christianity is stupid.
It's hard to listen to the cut and not laugh. If you have any sense of humor at all, or whatever, it's hard not to see the humor in it, and that it would result in anything as serious as this, I think, is ridiculous.
This isn't the first time controversial music has been linked to tragedy. Charles Manson said his murder spree was influenced by the Beatles' Helter Skelter. It's believed Night Stalker suspect Richard Ramirez was influenced by AC/DC's Highway to Hell album. An Ozzy Osbourne song, Suicide Solution, became the focal point of an actual suicide case involving a Southern California teenager.
What you can say is that music is a bystander involved to a certain degree, but most unlikely that it generated the mayhem. If it did, there'd be a lot more mayhem around.
Meanwhile, the members of Negativland are hoping for a speedy conclusion to the Brom case in Minnesota and eventually a return to their live performances.
Negativland ended up using this media coverage to their advantage, and they even used David's picture for the cover of their album titled Helter Stupid. Now, eventually, the band admitted that the news release regarding the cancellation of their 1988 tour by a federal official was false, and that they had also made up the story that David was listening to their song Christianity is Stupid before the murders. One of the members, Richard Lyons, stated that it was a way to show that the media could be easily manipulated. The band issued a further statement on their album citing, "Our lie was intended for and directed to the media, and it proved very effective in exposing the unreliable process of cannibalization that passes for news." The band got a lot of criticism for this, but in the end, their album sales increased. But as you can see, this was a pretty hot topic back then. In 1989, the Brom family murders even inspired a heavy metal band to release a song titled David Brom Took an Axe. Now in the end, with all the theories surrounding dark music, Satanism, and the occult, investigators announced that there was absolutely no evidence that David was influenced by any of that. It was yet another wave of hysteria surrounding the 1980s satanic panic.
Now, to many people's surprise, there were still a lot of people in the community who supported David. A few months after the murders, one of his friends told reporters, quote, "He wants to live his life now. He wants to get better. He regrets it, but he felt he had no other choice." End quote. One of the Brom's neighbors, and the family who David often babysat for, also defended him, saying, quote, "He was a nice kid. He just snapped." End quote. David's grandparents would also speak to the media. His grandfather came forward and said he forgave David, saying, quote, "You forgive the sinner, not the sin." End quote. As for Catherine Brom, Bernard's mother, she talked with the media about their family history with mental illness. She said that she suffered from depression, and so did her mother and her grandmother. She even stated that her father, David's great-grandfather, died by suicide after he tried to murder his wife with a knife. She said, quote, "You can see, when this happened to David, I could understand that there was an inherited tendency. I felt sorry for David. The whole family knew David and knew that normally he wasn't that kind of boy." End quote. And even when David had court appearances, reporters watched him like a hawk. Many were looking for any signs of a crazed teenage boy, but what they saw was far from that. In fact, they were surprised to see that David was very respectful, even holding a door open for one of the security guards. A newspaper reporter stated, quote, "It kind of struck me that here's this kid who murdered his family, and he's polite. It struck me as odd." End quote.
Now, that summer, while the state prepared for trial, David was actually sent to a mental health facility in Austin, Texas. According to reports, the average cost to stay there was $400 a day, and David's father's insurance was paying for his treatment. Days after being sent to Texas, the Brom's family home was put up for sale at an auction. The house was worth around $120,000, but given the horrors of what happened inside, people weren't necessarily jumping to pay full price, and it ended up being sold for around $80,000. The family van that David drove around after the murders also sold for about $2,900. Interestingly, David's older brother, Joe Brom, was at the auction, and when talking about this story, I think a lot about Joe. I can't imagine how it must have felt to have learned that his entire family had been killed by his brother, especially considering the fact that he was estranged from them at the time. But in the end, that might have saved his life. If he were to have been under his parents' roof that night, he very well could have been murdered too. Now, we weren't able to find any information on whether or not Joe was the recipient of that money made at the auction, but we assume that he was because he was the only surviving family member, but we just don't know.
Now, a few months after the murders, Judge Gerald Ring ruled that 16-year-old David Brom would be charged in the juvenile court system, meaning he would only have to spend a few years in jail because he was a minor. But when the public learned about this, they were outraged. Judge Ring even received death threats from people in the community. The judge would later say that he didn't even believe in his own ruling, saying, quote, "I don't agree with the outcome, but I have to follow the law." End quote. At the end of the day, despite how brutal the crime was, David Brom was a minor when he committed it. However, soon after this, the judge's decision was overturned by the state appeals court, meaning David was now going to be tried as an adult. His defense team would later try to appeal this decision to the Minnesota Supreme Court. On November 1st, defense attorney Terry Walters admitted to the Post-Bulletin, quote, "He looks like he's about 14. He was 16 at the time. My first impression was the incongruity of this horrendous crime and this gangly kid," end quote. But on December 9th, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that David Brom would be tried as an adult. Many people within their community were so relieved. They were terrified at the thought of David Brom walking around their streets in just a few years' time. But now, with this ruling, he faced a much longer sentence.
Nearly a year after the murders, in January of 1989, David was brought back to Rochester to be formally arraigned. His bail was set at $500,000. 1 month later, on February 27th, he officially pleaded not guilty by reason of mental illness. So, before his trial would start, he would be evaluated by several different psychiatrists. In the meantime, in September of that year, jury selection was underway. Now, because this was such an infamous story at the time, the defense team believed that they would have a hard time finding unbiased jurors. David's attorney, Terry Walters, told the Post-Bulletin, "I would question how intelligent that person is if he had never heard of this case." So, during selection, they asked the prospective jurors how much information they knew about the case and if they'd be able to look at graphic crime scene photographs and still be impartial. And by the end of September, they had chosen their jury. There were 9 women and 6 men, 3 of whom were alternates. But out of the 15 jurors, 11 of them were parents and 13 of them resided in Rochester, meaning that many had likely heard of the crime. But from there, David's trial commenced on Wednesday, September 27th, 1989, where both the defense and the prosecution delivered their opening statements. But something interesting about this trial is that, although David had confessed to the murders and his fingerprints had been found on the murder weapon, he never really explained why he had killed his family. His defense attorney, Terry Walters, stated, quote, "We know that David's perception of his life was so horrible that the only way out was to kill his family. To that extent, we know what the motive was. If we go beyond that and ask why did he feel that way, that motive we are never going to know," end quote. Another interesting fact was that David's brother Joe was never called to testify. But as for the mental illness defense, the state's professionals concluded that David was mentally competent.
Many of them agreed that David did in fact have depression. One even described him as a, quote, "seriously depressed boy," end quote. But they agreed that he knew right from wrong at the time he committed the murders. According to Dr. Malmquist, David viewed his parents as the source of his depression. He then added, quote, "But the family wasn't the source of his depression. It's a biological phenomenon. The family had some problems, but it wasn't the source," end quote. According to him, David blamed his parents for his mental health struggles, and after 2 failed suicide attempts, he believed that killing his family was the only way to relieve that depression. Shockingly, Dr. Malmquist also added, quote, "I think in killing his parents without thinking it through, the death saved David's life. Since then, he hasn't been nearly as depressed. So, in this strange way, they died in place of him," end quote. Now, David had been evaluated by 8 mental health professionals, and 7 found him to be mentally competent. However, the defense's psychiatrists disagreed. Dr. James Stevens evaluated David and concluded that he did not know right from wrong during the murders. He testified that David was on the cusp of psychosis, that he suffered from visual hallucinations, and that he even had 3 personalities. According to David, those personalities were named Justin Nicholas Time, Jimmy Sanders, and David Brom. Ultimately, Dr. Stevens diagnosed David with atypical psychosis, multiple personalities, and major depression. Now, during cross-examination, the prosecution asked Dr. Stevens if he himself had ever witnessed David's other personalities, but he admitted that he hadn't. David had just told him about them. So as you can imagine, many people, including the other medical professionals, were very skeptical of Dr. Stevens' findings. But interestingly, there was one witness whose testimony seemed to have backed up these claims. It was a girl from David's high school. She claimed that David had written her letters about the voices he heard, voices that told him to hurt himself and others. But I don't think those letters were ever brought in as evidence. So it would be up for the jury to decide if that was the truth. According to the people who witnessed the trial, it was a very difficult one to sit through. The crime scene photos were horrific, so much so the jurors were offered counseling. But by October 3rd, 1989, both sides rested their case. And from there, the jury left for deliberation. 4 hours later, they came back with a verdict. David Brom stood in the court, ready to hear his fate. By now, he looked much more mature than the black-haired 16-year-old boy he was when he murdered his family. He was an adult now. In fact, as he stood awaiting his verdict, it was actually his 18th birthday, and he was about to receive the worst birthday present one can imagine. David Brom was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he hung his head down. When asked if he wanted to address the court, David said no, staring despondently at the ground. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 4 life sentences for the murders of Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Ricky.
Jurors reached their verdict here on the second floor of the courthouse shortly after 11 this morning, but their long deliberation ended in a very strange way. As the verdicts were being read, ironically, church bells rang outside, all while David looked on in silence.
We're all glad it's over. I mean, the sentiment that I've heard here, but for myself personally, I feel that the sentence that he got was justifiable. I'm glad that he's not going to be on the street in my grandchildren, my children's lifetime.
On Monday, October 16th, 1989, David Brom was sent off to the Minnesota State Prison in St. Cloud to serve out his life sentence. But the following summer, David and his defense team claimed that his constitutional rights had been violated during the trial. They argued that the defense was not allowed to present psychiatric testimony in David's trial, and the judge refused to move the trial out of Olmsted County, despite the media frenzy surrounding the case. So, they wanted the Minnesota Supreme Court to reverse the convictions and give him a new trial. However, on November 30th, the Minnesota Supreme Court upheld the conviction and rejected the claim that David's constitutional rights had been violated. According to sources, David had had a hard time in prison since the very beginning. Because of his high-profile case, the inmates all knew about his crimes, and they often taunted him because of it. On one occasion, someone reportedly yelled, "Hey, you got your axe?" But to many people's surprise, many of David's loved ones kept in contact with him during his incarceration. His grandparents, aunts, and uncles regularly visited him. Diane's best friend, Patty Price, admitted that she still talked to David throughout the years. Now, as for David's older brother, Joe, we aren't sure whether or not they kept in contact, but we do know that Joe went on to live a very productive life. He obtained his bachelor's degree from Towson State University with majors in philosophy and economics. In 1998, he received an MA in philosophy from DeQuen's University in Pittsburgh and an MBA in 2004 from Waynesburg College in Pennsylvania. Then he became an assistant professor of economics and philosophy at Eastern Gateway Community College. Throughout the years, Joe was an avid outdoorsman. In 1995, he spent 6 months through hiking the Appalachian Trail, all the way from Georgia to Maine. Like we mentioned earlier in this story, Joe moved out of his parents' house and was essentially adopted into another family who treated him like their own. Throughout his whole life, he remained incredibly close with them. But unfortunately, on January 5th, 2016, at the young age of 46, Joe passed away from a battle with cancer. Sadly, there's little information about what his relationship with his brother looked like around that time.
But as we know, time moves on. No one who lived in Rochester at the time ever forgot about the Brom family murders. In fact, for most people, it would be ingrained in their minds forever. But year after year, the community did begin to heal. And a part of that healing for a lot of people was knowing that the Brom family got justice, that their killer was right where he belonged. As for David Brom, he decided to make the best of his time in prison. While there, he earned his high school diploma and he worked on the prison newspaper. Family members told the Post-Bulletin that David enjoyed working on computers and advertising. According to his grandmother, he passed the time by going to church and reading his Bible. He even worked on becoming a chaplain, and he counseled other inmates. Throughout the decades in prison, David only received one infraction in 1992 when he got in trouble for having too many people inside of his cell. But other than that, David was a model prisoner.
Even after so many years in prison, David never spoke to the media or even those closest to him about why he murdered his family. Instead, they usually talk with him about the happy times. His grandmother, David Brom, said, "We talk about what we did as a family together, the Thanksgivings we spent at my house, our visits in Rochester when they would come here for summer picnics in the yard. We remember the good times when we are together." One of the most haunting questions surrounding this case, however, has always been, why? What could drive a teenager to commit such a heinous act? Patty Price told KTTC that she had her own theories as to what may have happened.
Well, I have all sorts of theories on what was happening with David, having to do with priests, to be honest. But David has never been willing to talk about it. He talks about how much he misses his family. He talks about how, he really regrets snapping the way he did. And he talks about how much they loved him, and he very much misses them.
Now, after decades in prison, David Brom had come to terms with the fact that he would be incarcerated for the rest of his life. But in 2023, there were some big changes being made for juvenile offenders. That year, the Minnesota legislature passed a law abolishing life sentences without parole for people who committed crimes while they were minors. The new law stated that anyone under the age of 18 during the time of their crime were now eligible for supervised release, but they had to have served a minimum of 15 years if there was only one life sentence. In David's case, he had multiple life sentences, so he would have to serve a minimum of 30 years before he would be eligible for parole. And he had already completed his 30 years in 2018. Now, this didn't mean that just anyone would be sent back out on the streets. The state created a supervised release board that would review each individual case. Before making any decisions, they would look at the inmate's behavior in prison, their current mental health status, and whether or not they believed the person had been rehabilitated. And in January of 2025, David Brom stood in front of this board for the very first time. Here is an audio clip from that meeting.
Can you talk about your readiness, your journey, what led you to here, and the extent to which and how that, in your view, readied you for being considered for parole?
What led me to this point in my life?
Yeah, and your readiness, if for parole as you've described.
Okay. Yeah. So I've kind of spent my time the best that I can to change the things about my life that led me to the despair and the decisions that I made and the actions that I took, the crimes that I committed. I tried to change everything that I could about myself. And I believe that through the help of staff, programs, the support system I have in my life, I'm a good example of what a transformation can look like in a person's life through the Department of Corrections. I think that I've demonstrated consistency in that progress and in that maturing and growth, and I believe that I'm ready for parole.
So we've had a chance to talk about this in prior hearings, but I think it's, for purposes here, I think it's important. As you know, that the gravity of this offense is immense. Not just the impact on your family, but the community, and as you say, the ripple effect over the course of time. But as you think about, can you help give a sense of understanding of, through the lens of today, what happened that could allow you to engage in the conduct and the taking the lives of your family members, as you look back now through the lens of experience and history and the range of experiences and services that you participate in? How do you understand what you did at that time?
Yeah. First, if I could just take a minute to talk about the effects of the crime on others. I'd just like to apologize to the family and friends of Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Richard. I caused tremendous loss in their lives, incredible grief and pain, and left them with confusion and unanswered questions. And I apologize for that loss, for that grief, for the murders that I committed and the effect that it had on their life. I'd also like to apologize to the courts, the court officials, the sheriffs, who just as a matter of the service that they provide to their community, that they were a witness to the crimes that I committed. I apologize for the impact that had on their lives. And lastly, to the neighborhood, to the church we attended, the schools we were enrolled in, and the community of Rochester. I apologize for the ripple effects of losing an entire family in such a horrific way. And to give an idea of what leads a person to commit the murders that I did, I struggled with depression for some time, and it had clouded my thoughts, and it clouded my ability to process things. And I had grown to a short-sighted view that I thought these things were going to last forever. And I knew I couldn't live that way forever. And in the cloud of depression, I started to believe that other people were at fault for the way I felt. And unfortunately, that fault I placed on my parents and my family, because I was often more depressed at home than I was in other areas of life.
According to David, the summer after the murders, when he went to that treatment center in Austin, Texas, he really gained a better understanding of his depression. And over time, he started to realize the gravity of his crimes. But he admitted that it wasn't until his 20s, when his brain had finally developed, when he started to fully grasp the weight of what he had done.
When did you first start to get or gain a level of insight or clarity or an understanding of the depression? When did that begin to happen?
I started to understand a little bit about it when I was in the Oaks Treatment Center in Texas. That was a beneficial environment for me. They were supportive and encouraging, and but I really didn't grasp the effect that it was having on my life until it started to kind of dissipate. That cloud started to dissipate in my life as I pursued my faith and as I pursued the investments that other people were making in my life, probably closer to my early 20s.
Along the way, were there reconnections that you made with people who were significantly harmed by the offense?
Yeah, I've had connection with several family members all four of my grandparents, some aunts and uncles, and my older brother. I've also had some contact with a friend of my sister's. So I have had, not all of those have continued, but I have had some interactions with people who were affected by the crimes I committed.
What was that like for you? And as you, especially like as those things were happening or occurring or were about to occur, what was the experience of that? What was that like?
It's always difficult to hear how painfully you've affected someone else's life. And so it was a difficult thing to hear, and to hear how it didn't end. The effects of the crimes didn't end after the funeral or after a short period of time, that they continue to feel the effects of loss and grief. It was also honestly sometimes difficult to hear their acceptance of me into their lives as I struggled to go through the journey of finding a way to forgive and accept myself. It was difficult sometimes to hear their forgiveness and acceptance of me.
David essentially grew up in prison, and he had decades to reflect on his actions. During that time, he claimed that he had completely transformed from the person he used to be, and the board's officials could see that. One even said that it was highly unusual how clean his prison record was over the past 30 years, but they weren't ready to grant him full release just yet. Instead, they approved a work release program for David. In July of 2025, he was released from prison and put into a Twin Cities halfway house, where he will remain under supervision using a GPS monitor. But while here, David will have to prove that he has been truly rehabilitated, and many members of the board believe that he will do just that.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it and appreciate being part of this. I was just reflecting and thinking, when I first started seeing David, I was 29 years old. I'm 63. I know him. I know him very well. I've seen a lot of growth. He's the finest man I've ever met. He's grown. He's very, he's got a gift of encouragement. I guess I'll say it that way. And it's been a real blessing to be a part of his life and be with him on the journey.
Can you describe just the connection and how this came to be?
Yeah. So David was a friend of another inmate who was incarcerated at the time in St. Cloud, and they were pretty close. And then and I was visiting this other inmate at the time, he got transferred to Faribault, and he thought that it'd be good if I could begin seeing David and encourage Dave in his time. And so that started in, I'm going to say, summer of '91. And that's how we got connected. It was through another inmate that I was seeing at the time.
When you say that you witnessed considerable change in him over the course of time, what are some of the notable changes that you did observe in that span of time?
Yeah, well, I think I just saw him grow emotionally. He has learned a lot of skills on how to deal with different emotions, how to identify how actions are coming from those feelings, and those feelings come from thoughts, and those thoughts come from the heart. And so he's learned a lot about who he is, and He's learned a lot about how to identify issues more clearly, get to the root of issues, and deal with those in constructive, positive ways. And over the years, he's gotten really, really good at it and has been able to share that with other people.
Understandably, there have been pretty mixed reactions about David's release. Some people believe that he is truly rehabilitated and that he will live out the remainder of his life as a productive member of society. However, others aren't so sure of that. Now, the board has since stated that if David is approved for parole, he would not be allowed to return to Olmsted County where the murders occurred. But even so, the possibility of him being released at all does not sit well with a lot of people. Even decades later, some people were still feeling the effects of it. For these people, releasing David back into society would be like opening an old wound. One of the people who felt this way was Sheriff Kevin Torgerson, the same police officer that found the bodies of the Brom family. Here is a statement he issued regarding David's potential release.
Recently, it has come to light that David Brom, convicted for the murder of his family on February 18th, 1988, is about to be released. For the last 37 years, I have had reminders of the evening when I was sent to a secluded residential area north of the city of Rochester to check the welfare of Bernard Brom due to concerns from the school that his son attended, as they had heard rumors during the school day that David may have harmed his father. When Mr. Brom was convicted, Judge Yancey Morse sentenced him to 3 consecutive life terms, which means he served 17 and a half years for each term. The difficult thing for many in the community, as well as those of us that worked the case, was that Judge Morse made his 14-year-old sister Diane's file a concurrent sentence to little 10-year-old brother Ricky's. There were a lot of questions at the time why the judge had done that. Questions never answered were surrounded by the idea that Diane's life was somehow worth less than her younger brother's. Some argued that it was because Mr. Brom was 16 at the time, and the judge gave him some leniency due to him being a juvenile. Fast forward to the present time. Our legislature changed the law to where juvenile offenders of serious crimes in our state now do not have to serve their entire sentences before they can be eligible for parole, and made it effective immediately, including those previously currently incarcerated by our state, thus making Mr. Brom eligible. As Mr. Brom, as we are now told, has faced a parole board, they have determined he is now eligible to move from a medium security prison and step down to a halfway house and eventually finish the remainder of his sentence on parole in public. So with that, Mr. Brom is benefiting from leniency twice for mutilating 4 people, his family members, including his 2 younger siblings. Diane and little Ricky could be parents and very productive members of our society today, but were never given the chance due to Mr. Brom's selfish, immature 16-year-old actions. To Mr. Brom's credit, in my understanding, he has done remarkably well in the various prison settings and has reached an understanding of the seriousness of his crimes. Mr. Brom has apologized to everyone involved and is remorseful for his actions. I cannot stop what is already in motion, and we, as the public, must trust the parole board's decision and have to hope Mr. Brom is ready for this transition in his life. I'm very pleased to hear that, but it is still hard for me to accept and forget the sights and smells of what I saw that Thursday evening in 1988.
In January of 2026, David Brom will stand before the board again, and from there, they will determine his fate. It seems very likely that he will be granted parole. So, in just a few months, he could be back out in society for good. But to this day, the residents of Rochester still claim that the Brom family murders are the most brutal acts of violence their city has ever seen. And the Brom household, which sits on 2244 67th Street, has served as a reminder of the horrors that occurred on that dark day in February of 1988. Over the years, many residents of that town have actually claimed that the house is haunted. People have publicly reported seeing flickering lights, chairs moving on their own in the house, and hearing screaming late at night. One resident in town claimed that the rope swing hanging out front snapped inexplicably. And in 2012, a woman called 911 to report a burglary in progress, saying she heard moving furniture and voices inside of the home. But when police arrived, there were no signs of forced entry. The woman later told the Post-Bulletin, quote, "I don't want to talk about it. It was a false alarm," end quote. But according to the local police department, they've received a number of calls about strange happenings at the old Brom house. And since 1988, there have been a number of families who have moved in and out of the home. Sergeant Tom Clayman said, "The history of the house could be weighing on the minds of people who have lived there since the murders."
And whether the house is haunted or not, the story of the Brom family murders definitely haunts the minds of everyone who hears it. It's a story about a seemingly normal family in a normal town who were annihilated by one of their own, a 16-year-old boy who everyone described as polite, friendly, and kind. All these years later, people are still asking the same question they were asking in 1988. Why? Although David Brom admitted his guilt and expressed remorse, he still has never offered an explanation on why he killed Bernard, Paulette, Diane, and Ricky, and he may not ever have to give an explanation. It seems as though David Brom is already headed towards being released, but I guess we'll have to see in January of 2026.
Today, we will be making a donation to the JED Foundation, the JED Foundation, an organization that protects emotional health and works to prevent suicide in teens and young adults through working with schools, communities, and families to strengthen support systems and mental health programming. Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Murder in America. We are so happy to have the amount of people out there that listen to our show every week, and to have all of you joining us on this journey we have to tell the stories of victims and raise awareness surrounding these crimes and the issues that plague America. And yeah, Courtney and I are both just very thankful for everybody out there who listens every single week. If you want to help support the show and you want access to bonus content, please consider joining us on Patreon. On Patreon, you can get access to early ad-free episodes of every episode we release on the podcast, so you can get early access to the shows that have no ads in them. And if you want bonus episodes of Murder in America, we have a large library of bonus episodes that we've been creating for years on Patreon. There's over 120, 130 episodes on there that you can listen to. These are full-length episodes of the show, with both Courtney and I covering lots of different cases. We recently did the DC Snipers on there, and that was a wild episode. But yeah, we can't thank everybody who's joined us on Patreon enough. Thank you guys from the bottom of our hearts. In addition, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to this show, and follow us on Instagram at Murder in America to see photos from every single case that we cover in an episode. Anyways, y'all, we will be back next week. Once again, thank you all for listening. It's Colin here. I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.